On September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, a tall Pennsylvanian general named George Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He inherited a force that ranked 19th in the world, 19th, behind Portugal, behind Bulgaria, behind nations most Americans could not find on a map. The army had fewer than 175,000 men scattered across dozens of posts, a number that would barely fill 2 modern football stadiums. Its tanks were relics from the last war. Its soldiers trained with broomsticks because there were not enough rifles to go around. Trucks drove through training exercises with cardboard signs reading "tank" painted on their sides, because actual tanks did not exist in sufficient numbers. The situation was even worse than those numbers suggest. Continental forces were administered by 4 army headquarters, with skeleton staffs of barely 4,000 troops each. There was no tactical corps or field army headquarters ready to command troops in battle. The armored force, the tank command that would prove essential in modern warfare, did not even exist yet. It would not be established until July 1940. The army possessed not a single fully equipped division capable of deploying to combat. During the massive Louisiana maneuvers in 1941, the largest peacetime military exercises in American history, officers discovered the staggering gaps in their forces. Units lacked everything from ammunition to radios to basic medical supplies. Iron pipes stood in for artillery pieces. Beer cans substituted for grenades. Soldiers fired imaginary weapons and shouted "bang" to simulate combat. Purchasing agents traveled through Texas and Louisiana buying and renting horses directly from farms because even the cavalry lacked sufficient mounts. Some units could not conduct proper maneuvers because they had no maps of the terrain they were supposed to fight over. 7,000 miles away in Berlin, Adolf Hitler received intelligence reports about this American military and dismissed them with contempt. He saw a nation of businessmen and shopkeepers, a society he viewed as racially inferior and fundamentally incapable of sacrifice. His Air Minister Hermann Göring reportedly scoffed that Americans only knew how to make razor blades. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel later expressed concern about American industrial capacity in North Africa, Göring dismissed his worries. Rommel, who had actually encountered American equipment in battle, shot back that he could use some of those razor blades. The exchange, preserved in Rommel's papers, captured the dangerous gap between German assumptions and the reality that was about to overwhelm them. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Within 6 years, that 19th ranked army would field over 8 million soldiers. Those factories making refrigerators and automobiles would produce nearly 300,000 military aircraft. A nation that built fewer than 3,000 warplanes in 1939 would build approximately 96,000 in 1944 alone. The transformation would be so complete, so overwhelming, that it would bury the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of steel and aluminum the German High Command never imagined possible. This is the story of how they got it so wrong, and how America proved them wrong in ways that still echo through history. The German miscalculation began with ideology. Hitler's entire worldview rested on the belief that national strength flowed from racial purity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed inherent superiority that no amount of industrial capacity could overcome. America, in his view, represented the opposite, a nation of immigrants, a melting pot of races and ethnicities from every corner of the globe. Jews and African Americans held positions in American society that would be unthinkable in Nazi Germany. To Hitler, this diversity was not strength but fatal weakness. A mongrel society, he believed, could never unite for the sacrifices that total war demanded. In private conversations, recorded by stenographers during meals and evening gatherings, Hitler expressed open contempt for American society. Historians have raised questions about certain translations of these records, noting that the English versions passed through intermediaries of questionable reliability. But the consistent theme across multiple independent sources is unmistakable. Hitler believed Americans were soft and undisciplined. He saw a nation that had grown comfortable during the long peace between wars, addicted to automobiles and motion pictures and consumer goods. Such people, he was certain, would never match the martial spirit of Germans who had been hardened by years of economic struggle and ideological commitment. This racial analysis shaped German strategic thinking at the highest levels. When intelligence officers presented reports on American industrial capacity, These reports were filtered through ideological assumptions that predetermined their conclusions. Yes, America had factories. Yes, those factories were productive. But factories alone did not win wars. You needed warriors willing to die. You needed a unified national will. You needed what the Nazis believed was racial cohesion and purity of purpose. America, the Germans believed, had none of these essential qualities. Göring, who had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into the most feared air force in Europe, shared his leader's dismissal of American potential. He had seen German air power crush Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks. He had watched his bombers pound Britain during the Blitz. The idea that American automobile workers could somehow challenge his professional air force seemed laughable. The evidence the Germans used to support their contempt seemed reasonable at the time. The American army in 1939 was indeed tiny. Its equipment was indeed obsolete, much of it dating to the First World War or earlier. Congress had cut military budgets throughout the 1930s, reflecting deep public isolationism following the disillusionment of the last war. Defense spending hovered around just 1% of gross domestic product. By 1940, it had risen only to 1.7%. The Neutrality Acts prohibited arms sales to nations at war. A majority of Americans believed Europe's conflicts were not their concern. Polls showed consistent opposition to involvement in foreign wars. When Germany conquered France in a mere 6 weeks during the spring of 1940, the American military could not have mounted a serious defense of its own coastline, let alone projected power across the Atlantic. German military intelligence compiled careful assessments of American war production capabilities and concluded that President Franklin Roosevelt's ambitious claims were nothing more than propaganda designed to intimidate without substance. When Roosevelt told Congress on May 16, 1940, that he wanted America geared up to produce 50,000 aircraft per year, the German High Command reportedly treated the number as absurd. At that moment, American factories were producing perhaps 6,000 military aircraft annually. Total American aircraft production in 1939 had been around 2,100 planes. The idea of increasing production by 8 or 10 times seemed physically impossible. Where would the workers come from? Where would the aluminum come from? Where would the machine tools come from? It was, the Germans concluded, American bluster designed to frighten enemies without the industrial capacity to back it up. What the Germans failed to understand was the crucial difference between American peacetime performance and American wartime potential. They saw a nation that had not mobilized and concluded it could not mobilize. They saw factories making consumer goods and assumed those factories could not be converted to make weapons. They measured capability by current output rather than by underlying industrial infrastructure. They looked at what America was producing and failed to see what America could produce. It was perhaps the most consequential intelligence failure of the 20th century. The transformation began even before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt understood that Britain's survival depended on American industrial support, and that American survival might eventually depend on American military strength. As early as May 1940, he challenged American industry to perform what he called a miracle of production. The automobile factories would stop making cars. The appliance plants would stop making refrigerators and washing machines. Every lathe, every press, every assembly line in America would be converted to war production. The man Roosevelt chose to oversee this transformation was a Danish immigrant named William Knudsen. Born in Copenhagen in 1879, Knudsen had arrived in America in 1900 with $30 in his pocket and limited English. Through extraordinary talent and relentless work ethic, he rose through the ranks of American industry to become president of General Motors, one of the largest corporations on Earth. When Roosevelt asked his advisor, Bernard Baruch, to name the best production man in America, Baruch reportedly replied that the list was simple. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. There was simply no one else who combined Knudsen's technical knowledge, organizational ability, and practical experience at such scale. Knudsen accepted the job for a salary of $1 per year. In January 1942, he was commissioned directly as a lieutenant general, the only civilian in American history to enter the army at that rank. He knew that winning this war would require convincing bitter corporate rivals to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. Ford and General Motors and Chrysler had spent decades competing ferociously for the same customers. Their executives viewed each other as enemies. Now they would need to share blueprints, coordinate suppliers, divide production responsibilities, and work toward common goals. Knudsen convened meetings where executives who normally would not speak to each other sat together planning how to build bombers instead of sedans. He used his personal relationships with industrial leaders across the country to break down barriers. He persuaded Henry Ford, who deeply distrusted Roosevelt and had resisted government involvement in his business, to convert 20% of Ford facilities to defense production. The conversion happened with remarkable speed because American industry possessed capabilities the Germans never truly understood. The key was standardization and interchangeable parts. American factories had pioneered mass production techniques over decades of making automobiles, appliances, farm equipment, and machinery. Different facilities in different states could manufacture components that fit together perfectly regardless of where they were made. A carburetor produced in Ohio would fit an engine made in Michigan would power a vehicle assembled in California. This system of standardized production had been developed for civilian goods. Now it was applied to weapons of war. The automobile companies had already mastered the coordination of suppliers across hundreds of miles. Their managers knew how to train workers quickly for repetitive precision tasks. Their engineers understood how to move materials through factories efficiently. These skills transferred directly to aircraft and tank and ship production. The aircraft industry itself underwent explosive growth, unlike anything seen before or since. In 1940, the entire American aircraft manufacturing workforce numbered perhaps 59,000 people. By 1943, it exceeded 900,000. Add in those building engines and components at other facilities, and the total surpassed 2 million workers. Aircraft manufacturing rose from 41st among American industries to first place in under 5 years, a transformation without parallel in economic history. The production numbers tell the story of this transformation better than any description. In 1940, American factories produced 6,028 military aircraft. In 1941, the number rose to 19,445. In 1942, following Pearl Harbor, production exploded to 47,675. In 1943, it reached 85,433, exceeding even Roosevelt's once impossible target of 50,000. And in 1944, American factories delivered approximately 96,000 military aircraft, nearly double the figure that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. The total, from January 1940 through August 1945, was 299,230 military aircraft. This official count from the Army Air Force's Statistical Digest represents the most remarkable industrial achievement in human history. America alone produced more aircraft than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined produced during the entire war. American output in 1944 alone exceeded Japan's entire wartime production. The factories that Göring mocked as capable only of making razor blades had buried the Luftwaffe. By airframe weight, the disparity was even more staggering. In 1944, American factories produced 961 million pounds of airframe compared to Germany's 174 million pounds, a ratio of more than 5 to 1. This weight difference meant that American aircraft were not just more numerous, but often larger and more capable. Heavy bombers that could strike deep into enemy territory rolled off assembly lines in quantities Germany could never match. Consider what these numbers meant in practical terms. At peak production in March 1944, American factories completed more than 9,000 aircraft in a single month. That works out to over 300 aircraft per day, more than 12 per hour. One aircraft rolling off assembly lines somewhere in America approximately every 5 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week, month after month. The most dramatic production story centered on a factory in Michigan that came to symbolize American industrial might. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was conceived during a single sleepless night in January 1941. Charles Sorensen, Ford's vice president of production and the man who had helped develop the moving assembly line concept decades earlier, visited the Consolidated Aircraft factory in San Diego to study how they built the B-24 Liberator bomber. What Sorensen saw appalled him. Aircraft were being assembled essentially by hand, outdoors in many cases, using methods that had not changed significantly in decades. Workers moved from station to station carrying tools, Parts arrived in no particular order. Skilled craftsmen spent enormous time fitting components together that should have been interchangeable. It was exactly the kind of inefficient job shop production that Ford had eliminated from automobile manufacturing 30 years before. Sorensen spent that night in his hotel room sketching a different approach on notepaper. He envisioned a factory where bombers would be built the same way Ford built automobiles, on a moving assembly line with specialized stations, handling specific tasks in sequence. Parts would arrive exactly when needed. Workers would stay in place while the aircraft moved past them. Every operation would be timed and coordinated. The next morning, Sorensen showed the sketch to Edsel Ford over breakfast. The result of one night's hard work, Sorensen later wrote, became the true outline of Willow Run. The factory that architect Albert Kahn designed from Sorensen's sketch was staggering in scale. The main building covered 3.5 million square feet under one roof, making it the largest factory building anywhere in the world. The assembly line stretched more than a mile in length. The entire structure measured over 3,200 feet long and nearly 1,300 feet wide. An L-shaped layout featured a famous 90-degree turn where partially assembled bombers rotated on turntables. This design quirk existed because the assembly line would otherwise have crossed from Washtenaw County into Wayne County, subjecting the entire plant to higher taxes. The turntables allowed production to continue without crossing the county line. Charles Lindbergh, who consulted on the project and served as a test pilot, called the completed facility the Grand Canyon of a mechanized world. Building the factory was the easy part. Making it actually work was far harder. The B-24 Liberator was exponentially more complex than any automobile ever built. A typical car contained roughly 15,000 parts. The B-24 contained approximately 488,000 parts. The aircraft required over 360,000 rivets, each of which had to be installed properly, or the plane might fail catastrophically in flight. Workers had to be trained not just in new skills, but in entirely new levels of precision. An automobile that was slightly out of tolerance would still run, perhaps with some rattling or reduced efficiency. An aircraft that was slightly out of tolerance might shed a wing at altitude and kill its entire crew. The margin for error was essentially zero. The ramp-up was agonizing. Through all of 1942, Willow Run produced only 56 completed aircraft. The entire enormous facility, the largest factory in the world, delivered fewer aircraft in a year than some smaller plants produced in a week. Newspapers began calling the plant Will It Run instead of Willow Run. A congressional committee led by Senator Harry Truman issued scathing reports questioning whether Ford could ever deliver on its promises. Critics wondered publicly whether the project was an enormous waste of government money. The problems were numerous and severe. Housing did not exist for the thousands of workers the plant needed. Transportation was inadequate. Training programs were insufficient. The aircraft design kept changing as Consolidated made improvements, requiring constant retooling. Suppliers failed to deliver parts on schedule. Worker turnover exceeded 50% annually because conditions were so difficult. The stress took a terrible toll. Edsel Ford, already suffering from health problems including stomach cancer, drove himself relentlessly to make the plant succeed. He visited constantly, pushed for solutions, and took personal responsibility for problems that others could not solve. He died on May 26, 1943, at age 49. Many who knew him believed the enormous pressure of Willow Run contributed to his early death. But Sorensen and his team persevered despite every setback. They solved the engineering problems one by one. They refined the training programs until workers could perform precision tasks reliably. They broke the aircraft down into sub-assemblies that could be built separately and joined on the final line. They instituted quality control systems that caught errors before they became catastrophes. They built housing and improved transportation and created systems to reduce turnover. And then the production numbers began to climb in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. By April 1944, Willow Run was producing B-24 bombers at a rate that justified every promise Ford had ever made. Workers in 2 9-hour shifts completed 453 aircraft in 468 hours, one bomber every 63 minutes. Wing assembly time that had once required 13 days was reduced to a single hour. The forging department produced 7 million rivets daily in over 500 different sizes. 100 completed bombers flew away from Willow Run in just 72 hours during a remarkable three-day burst in late April 1944. At peak production, the workforce reached approximately 42,500 people. But remarkably, as efficiency improved, the workforce actually shrank even as production increased. By summer 1944, improved processes meant that only 17,000 workers were needed to maintain peak output. This counterintuitive result demonstrated that peak employment and peak production did not necessarily coincide. The factory had learned how to do more with less. Over the course of the war, Ford's Willow Run produced approximately 8,700 B-24 aircraft, counting both complete bombers and knockdown kits shipped to other plants for final assembly. The B-24 Liberator became the most produced American military aircraft in history, with total production across all manufacturers exceeding 18,400 units. The critics who said it could never be mass-produced had been proven spectacularly wrong. But Willow Run was just one factory among dozens. Across America, manufacturers were achieving similar transformations in aircraft type after aircraft type. North American Aviation created what many consider the finest fighter aircraft of the entire war. When British purchasing agents approached the company in early 1940 about building P-40 fighters under license, company president James Kindleberger made a bold counterproposal. Give him 120 days, and his team would design something better from scratch. Lead designer Edgar Schmude, a German-born immigrant who had largely taught himself aeronautical engineering, led a team that worked around the clock. They rolled out the completed airframe in just 102 days, beating their deadline by more than 2 weeks. The prototype emerged without an engine because the Allison power plant was not yet ready, and with landing gear borrowed from a training aircraft because the intended gear had not arrived. The first flight came on October 26, 1940, 149 days after contract signing. The aircraft they created was the P-51 Mustang, and it would transform the air war over Europe. Early versions powered by Allison engines performed adequately at low altitudes, but lost significant power above 15,000 feet. This altitude limitation restricted the Mustang's usefulness as a bomber escort, since bombers typically flew at 20,000 feet or higher to avoid anti-aircraft fire. The transformation came when British engineers suggested mating the exceptional Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The American version of this engine, built under license by Packard, was designated the V1650. The combination proved extraordinary. Speed jumped from around 390 miles per hour to over 440. The service ceiling increased dramatically. With external drop tanks that could be jettisoned after use, the Merlin-powered Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,600 miles. No previous American fighter could accomplish this mission. Before the Mustang, American bombers had to fly the final portion of their missions into Germany without fighter protection, suffering devastating losses to German interceptors. The first Mustang escort mission to Berlin came in March 1944. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe's sanctuary over the German heartland ended. American fighters could now follow the bombers anywhere and challenge German interceptors over their own territory. Mustang pilots claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, and another 4,000 destroyed on the ground by strafing. These figures represent wartime claims, and may include some overcounting, as was common among all air forces. More than 280 Mustang pilots became aces with 5 or more confirmed victories. Roughly half of all enemy aircraft destroyed by American forces in Europe fell to Mustangs. Total production reached approximately 15,600 pounds, 51 Mustangs. The fighter that was designed in 102 days helped win air superiority over Europe. Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress became the symbol of American strategic bombing. The company had gambled its entire future on the aircraft, building the original prototype designated Model 299 with its own money, after the Army had initially favored a cheaper competitor. When the prototype crashed during testing on October 30, 1935, due to locked controls that the pilot had forgotten to release, Boeing nearly went bankrupt. But the Army ordered 13 aircraft for further evaluation, and the design proved its fundamental worth. Total production eventually exceeded 12,700 B-17 bombers through a production pool that included Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, and Lockheed Vega in Burbank. The arrangement allowed multiple factories to build identical aircraft using standardized parts and procedures. Labor hours per aircraft dropped dramatically as workers gained experience. The first B-17s required 142,000 labor hours each in September 1941. By August 1944, the figure had fallen to just 15,300 hours, an 89% reduction that captured the learning curve of mass production. Workers who had taken months to build one bomber now built one in weeks. The B-17 dropped more bombs in the European theater than any other American aircraft. Douglas Aircraft produced over 10,000 C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft, the military version of the legendary DC-3 commercial airliner. The C-47 became the aerial workhorse of the Allied forces. It hauled cargo across oceans. It evacuated wounded soldiers from forward airfields. It towed gliders full of infantry into battle. It dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. It supplied partisans in occupied territory. On D-Day alone, approximately 1,000 C-47s dropped paratroopers and towed gliders behind German lines in Normandy. The aircraft carried the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions into battle. Without the C-47, the airborne operations that helped secure the invasion would have been impossible. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir Crusade in Europe that 4 pieces of equipment stood out as among the most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe: the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Curiously enough, he noted, none of these was designed for combat. All were support equipment. But without them, the combat forces could not have functioned. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the most ambitious and expensive aircraft program of the war. Development cost approximately $3 billion, making it the single most expensive weapons program of the entire conflict, exceeding even the Manhattan Project's $2 billion effort to develop the atomic bomb. The aircraft featured revolutionary technology. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate at high altitudes without oxygen masks or heavy heated suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets aimed by analog computers allowed fewer gunners to defend the aircraft from more directions. 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines each generated over 2,000 horsepower. The combination produced an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber in history while carrying a heavier bomb load. The technological ambition came with terrible costs. Engine fires were a persistent and deadly problem throughout development. The enormous R-3350 engines generated so much heat that they frequently caught fire during operation. The second prototype crashed on February 18, 1943, when an engine fire spread to the wing. The burning aircraft plunged into a Seattle meatpacking plant, killing all 10 crew members plus 20 people on the ground. Despite these setbacks and others, the program pressed forward because nothing else could deliver the payload the military needed to the targets it needed to reach. Total production reached 3,970 B-29 aircraft, built at 4 different facilities across the country. The B-29 would carry the atomic bombs that ended the war with Japan. The workforce that built these aircraft represented its own kind of transformation, one that would reshape American society in ways that extended far beyond the war itself. Women had comprised barely 1% of the aircraft industry before the war. Most factories simply did not hire women for production work. By 1943, more than 310,000 women worked in American aircraft factories. At some plants, women represented 65% or more of the total workforce. Across the entire aircraft industry at peak production in late 1943, women accounted for approximately 37% of the 2 million workers. At Willow Run, roughly 12,000 women made up about 35% of the workforce. They operated the same riveting guns and welding equipment as men, and received the same hourly wage of 85 cents. At Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, women represented 40% of the 41,000 workers at peak employment. At Lockheed, which had only 5 women on its entire factory payroll before the war, thousands learned to rivet fuselages, weld components, install electrical wiring, and perform every task previously reserved exclusively for men. The most famous symbol of these working women became known as Rosie the Riveter. The name derived from a 1942 song celebrating women in war work. Several women became associated with the Rosie image. Roswell Monroe was a riveter at Willow Run, who was discovered by actor Walter Pidgeon during a factory tour and appeared in war bond promotional films. Naomi Parker Fraley, photographed at a naval air station in California in 1942, is now considered the most likely model for the famous "We Can Do It" poster painted by J. Howard Miller. The truth is that Rosie was not any one woman but millions of them. Housewives who had never held a tool learned to operate precision machinery. Teachers and secretaries and shop clerks, trained as welders and electricians. Mothers worked swing shifts while neighbors watched their children. They were ordinary Americans who learned extraordinary skills because their country needed them. African Americans also entered the defense workforce in unprecedented numbers, though they faced obstacles their white counterparts did not. In June 1941, facing the threat of a massive march on Washington, organized by labor leader A. Philip Randolph, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. It was the first federal civil rights directive since Reconstruction, declaring that there shall be no discrimination in defense employment because of race, creed, color, or national origin. The reality on the ground often fell far short of the proclamation. Many aircraft companies openly refused to hire African American workers for skilled positions. Some company executives stated publicly that it was against their policy to employ African Americans as aircraft workers, regardless of their training or qualifications. But the relentless pressure of wartime demand gradually forced change. Companies that could not find enough white workers eventually began hiring African Americans out of sheer necessity. African Americans rose from 3% of the defense workforce in early 1942 to over 8% by April 1944. The Pittsburgh Courier newspaper launched the Double V campaign on February 7, 1942. The two V's stood for victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. A letter from a 26-year-old defense worker named James Thompson had sparked the campaign. Thompson asked why African Americans should be expected to fight for democracy overseas while being denied democracy at home. The Double V achieved overwhelming support in the African American community, with surveys showing over 90% approval. It helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would emerge in the decades following the war. The men who had so confidently dismissed American industrial potential eventually faced the consequences of their catastrophic miscalculation. The air war over Europe told the story of German assumptions meeting American abundance in the most brutal possible way. The Luftwaffe's pilots were among the best trained in the world at the war's outset. Their aircraft, particularly fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were formidable machines equal or superior to anything the Allies fielded. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed their American counterparts. Many German aces accumulated over 100 aerial victories, numbers no American pilot approached. But attrition was relentless and ultimately decisive. For every German aircraft shot down, American factories produced 3 more. For every experienced German pilot killed, the training pipeline in Texas and California and Arizona produced 5 replacements. The Luftwaffe bled out slowly, not from any single decisive defeat, but from the cumulative weight of an enemy who could absorb any losses and keep coming back stronger. The critical turning point came during Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week, in late February 1944. From February 20th through the 25th, Allied air forces launched massive, coordinated attacks against German aircraft production facilities. Approximately 3,800 bomber sorties and thousands of fighter sorties struck targets across Germany. The losses on both sides were significant. The Americans lost approximately 226 bombers during the operation. The Germans lost roughly 290 fighters in aerial combat. But the asymmetry of the situation was decisive. American bomber losses were entirely replaceable within a few weeks. German fighter losses were not. American factories could build new bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. German factories, increasingly battered by the bombing campaign, could not replace losses fast enough. The pilot quality gap widened with each passing month. At the war's outset, German pilots received some of the finest training in the world, accumulating over 200 flight hours before entering combat. Some received considerably more. These well-trained pilots formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe's exceptional early performance. But as the war dragged on and fuel became increasingly scarce, training programs collapsed. Aviation gasoline that should have gone to training schools went instead to combat operations. By late 1944, new German pilots entered combat with as few as 80 to 110 total flight hours. Many had only 15 to 20 hours in the actual aircraft type they would fly in battle. They were barely qualified to take off and land, let alone engage experienced Allied fighters in aerial combat. American pilots, meanwhile, maintained training standards that would have seemed extravagant by German standards. The Army Air Forces graduated approximately 193,000 pilots during the war. These men received 300 to 400 or more hours of flight training before seeing combat. Navy and Marine pilots received even more. The training infrastructure that had seemed excessive in peacetime proved invaluable in war. American replacement pilots arrived at combat units genuinely prepared to fight. German replacement pilots increasingly arrived as little more than targets waiting to be destroyed. In the 5 months before D-Day, over 2,200 German fighter pilots died. In May 1944 alone, approximately 25% of Germany's entire fighter pilot force perished. Monthly fighter losses ran between 40 and 50% of available aircraft from March through May. Adolf Galland, the fighter ace who commanded Germany's fighter forces, later testified that most new pilots were lost during their first 5 combat missions. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, the disparity in air power was undeniable. The Allies had nearly 13,000 aircraft available to support the invasion. Germany's Air Fleet 3, responsible for defending against the invasion, had just 319 serviceable aircraft in the entire invasion zone. The Luftwaffe flew 1 sortie for every 37 flown by the Allies. Of the mere dozen German fighter bombers that managed to reach the invasion beaches, 10 dropped their bombs prematurely and fled without accomplishing anything. German soldiers on the ground developed a bitter joke that captured their despair. American planes were grey, they said, British planes were black, and Luftwaffe planes were invisible. General Eisenhower assured his troops before the invasion that if they saw fighting aircraft over them, those aircraft would be ours. He was stating simple fact. Field Marshal Rommel wrote to his wife on June 10th, 4 days after the invasion began, that the enemy's air superiority had a very grave effect on German movements. There was simply no answer to it. German forces could not move in daylight without being attacked from the air. Tanks, trucks, and troop columns were destroyed on roads throughout France. The supplies that German defenders desperately needed never arrived because Allied aircraft destroyed them in transit. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, identified May 12, 1944, as the day the technological war was lost. That was when Allied bombers struck the Leuna synthetic fuel plant in force. Germany, which lacked natural petroleum resources, depended entirely on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into aviation gasoline. The Allied bombing campaign systematically destroyed these facilities. Aviation fuel production collapsed from 181,000 tons in March 1944 to 53,000 tons by June to just 11,000 tons by January 1945. A 94% reduction. German aircraft sat on airfields for lack of fuel to fly them. Pilots received no training because there was no fuel for training flights. Combat missions were rationed and restricted. German aircraft production actually achieved its peak in 1944, building over 40,000 planes under Speer's dispersal program. The industry spread from 27 major plants to over 700 dispersed sites, many using forced labor from concentration camps, but the achievement was meaningless. Those planes could not fly because there was no fuel. Those pilots could not train because there was no gasoline for training. The production miracle Hitler had dismissed as American propaganda had destroyed the Luftwaffe by burying it in numbers Germany could not match while simultaneously cutting off the fuel it needed to fight. Galland summarized the situation with brutal clarity. Germany had lost absolute air supremacy from the very first moment of the Allied invasion. The nation whose production capacity Göring had mocked now dominated the skies so completely that German aircraft were essentially irrelevant. Hitler himself never accepted responsibility for this catastrophic miscalculation. In his final days in the Berlin bunker, surrounded by the ruins of his Reich, he ranted about miracle weapons that would turn the tide, about divisions that existed only on paper, about counter-offensives that could not possibly succeed. He blamed his generals for betraying him. He blamed the German people for failing him. He never acknowledged that his fundamental assumptions about America had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. The nation he had dismissed as racially inferior had crushed his armies. The mongrel society he believed could never unify had achieved the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. The soft consumers he thought incapable of sacrifice had sent 16 million men and women into uniform and transformed their entire economy for war. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin offered a toast that captured the truth the Germans had missed. At Winston Churchill's birthday dinner on November 30th, Stalin asked to make one final remark after Churchill had called the last toast. Raising his glass, Stalin declared that without American planes, the war would have been lost. The official diplomatic record from the US State Department preserves his exact words. It was an extraordinary admission from a man who rarely praised anyone, let alone capitalist America. Stalin's forces had received thousands of American aircraft, trucks, jeeps, and tons of supplies through the Lend-Lease program. He understood, perhaps better than anyone outside America itself, that the war was being won in the factories of Detroit and Los Angeles and Wichita as much as on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood what the Germans did not. Unlike Hitler, Yamamoto had lived in America. He studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He traveled across the country, toured its factories, and assessed its oil production and steel mills. He saw with his own eyes what American industrial capacity could become if roused to war. Before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto warned his superiors that Japan might run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year, but he had absolutely no confidence about what would happen if the conflict went on for 2 or 3 years. His prediction proved remarkably accurate. The Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War, came just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japan never recovered the strategic initiative. The famous quote attributed to Yamamoto about awakening a sleeping giant and filling it with terrible resolve almost certainly originated from a 1970 film rather than from any historical document. Historians have searched for a primary source and found none. The screenwriters apparently invented the line. But the sentiment it expresses was genuine. Those who understood America knew that its peacetime lethargy masked enormous potential. Those who underestimated that potential paid the ultimate price. The workers who achieved this transformation have largely faded from historical memory. Charles Sorensen wrote a memoir documenting what his teams accomplished at Willow Run, but few Americans today recognize his name. The women who learned to rivet and weld returned mostly to domestic life after the war, their contributions celebrated briefly, and then largely forgotten until historians began recovering their stories decades later. The African-American workers who fought for the right to contribute and then proved their abilities faced continued discrimination, even as the nation they helped save began its long, slow struggle toward civil rights. The factories themselves have mostly vanished. Willow Run was converted to automobile production after the war and operated for decades under various owners before finally closing. The assembly lines that built B-24 Liberators every 63 minutes were reconfigured, replaced, and eventually demolished. The physical evidence of the production miracle has largely disappeared. But the lesson endures. The German miscalculation was ultimately a failure of imagination rooted in ideology. Hitler and his generals looked at America and saw what they expected to see: a soft, divided, undisciplined nation unsuited for war. They did not see what actually existed beneath the surface: a sleeping giant with industrial capacity beyond anything the world had ever known, organizational talent honed by decades of mass production, and human determination that would prove unstoppable once awakened. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who orchestrated much of this transformation, later summarized what American industry achieved. "We won," he said, "because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible." He was right, and the Germans who dismissed American production claims as propaganda learned too late that those claims were not propaganda at all. They were prophecy. The nation that ranked 19th in military strength became the arsenal of democracy. The factories that supposedly could only make razor blades produced 300,000 aircraft. The mongrel society Hitler despised fought with unity and determination that his racially pure Reich could never match. Every assumption the Nazis made about America proved catastrophically wrong, and that miscalculation cost them everything. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community of history enthusiasts spans the globe, and we love hearing from all of you. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these important stories alive for future generations.